Chapter 12, Promise Fulfilled. In the normal course, Gabriel would have been transferred directly after profession to another retreat to commence his studies for the priesthood. But other decisions had been made, and eventually he remained in the novitiate at Moravel for almost another year. For the present, wrote Gabriel to his father, relaying current community gossip, and perhaps for the whole winter, we'll stay here. As to where we'll be sent afterwards, there's a rumor there will be Purgatoria near Camerino. During this waiting period, his studies were mainly a revision of familiar ground. In the same letter, he mentioned that he was studying Latin again, a subject that should have presented little difficulty to a prize-winning scholar from Spoleto College. But Gabriel was far from ideal. Another form of learning had absorbed all his interest, and he threw himself heart and soul into the study of sanctity, the science of the saints. To this he devoted every minute he had. He treasured time as a miser hoards his gold, feeling that if he deliberately wasted time, he would be robbing Almighty God. Having made his profession, Gabriel realized in all earnestness that he had contracted serious obligations. He had bound himself by vow to live poor, chaste, and obedient. The time had now come to fulfill those promises. Did he perhaps recall, as an added incentive, the broken promises of youth? During his novitiate, he had become familiar with the theory of the spiritual life. Now it had to be reduced to practice. In quotes, "It's not enough to talk about virtue," he said in his usual forthright way. "We must practice it too. God does not want us to keep our hands in our pockets. St. Philip Neri used to say that heaven was not made for idlers." End quotes. Gabriel and his father held diametrically opposite views about the obligations of religious profession. Sante Pacenti apparently expected now that Gabriel was professed that many of his restrictions in the novitiate would be relaxed, and that he would therefore enjoy a larger measure of freedom. With this in mind, he began to plan visits from the family, outings in the country, trips that would take Gabriel to visit his relatives. Naively, he wrote to inquire when Gabriel would be free to start. Gabriel was alarmed. The world, which he had quitted so decisively, was threatening to encroach on him again. His vows were the barrier that would keep his solitude undisturbed. Firmly but tactfully, he dealt with his father's grandiose plans, explaining that the whole project was impossible. In quotes, "In your last letter, you spoke of the trip to Monte Gregorio, pointing out that now was the time to make it. Father dear, would you like me to tell you frankly how I feel about this? I would say that such a visit seems to be quite unnecessary. Moreover, it is incompatible with my present status and might perhaps involve spiritual loss. I would say furthermore that with us Passionists such visits are not customary, even for the older fathers. Now would I not show great impertinence, I am who but newly professed, in approaching my superiors with such a request that would not be made by the oldest among us." End quotes. His father took the hint. No more was said of the proposed visit, and for the time being, Gabriel was left in peace. Once this unexpected complication was removed, he was able to concentrate on his main purpose, to keep his rule with absolute perfection. The great canonist Pope Benedict XIV is said to have remarked, in quotes, "Show me a religious who keeps his rule perfectly, and I will canonize him in his lifetime." End quotes. This basic principle was the underlying secret of Gabriel's sanctity. To the rule he looked for guidance. From the rule he took his inspiration. For him, the rule was the manifestation of God's will. He already made a resolution, in quotes, "I shall observe every rule, even the least." End quote. Not for him to pick and choose, to interpret it this way or that. All was to be observed with simplicity, faith, and love. Gabriel loved his rule, and was proud of his vocation to be a Passionist. He was heard to say that if the choice of a vocation were to be offered to him 100 times, he would have chosen the Passionist every time. In quotes, "Poverty is the standard under which the whole congregation fights." End quotes. So reads the first sentence of the chapter dealing with poverty in the Passionist rule. Gabriel often thanked God for being called to an institute which professed rigorous poverty and practiced a perfect common life. By constant meditation on the poverty of Christ, Gabriel fostered in his soul such a love for poverty that nothing seemed too hard to bear. St. Bernadette Soubirous, his contemporary and kindred soul, would say later that, in quotes, "poverty must be not only embarrassing but crucifying," end quotes, a sentiment that would have won his enthusiastic approval. The ideal enshrined in the Passionist rule fired his heart by its simple recommendation to the brethren that, in quotes, "as true imitators of Jesus Christ, they may show themselves poor in reality and affection, keeping continually before their eyes the example of our Savior, who for our sakes vouchsafed to be born in poverty, to live in want, and to die naked on the cross." End quotes. Making light of the incidental hardship, Gabriel was determined to be poor in reality and affection. His small cell was kept spotlessly neat and clean, and devoid of all that was not strictly necessary. At intervals, he made a thorough examination of every single item, weighing it in the balance against poverty. If he found anything that appeared superfluous, even such a trifle as a medal or a small picture, he brought it to the superior. Once he was told to retain a book he wished to surrender, as it would probably prove useful to him later. His ingenious reply was, in quotes, "Just now I don't seem to need it. When the time comes that it'll be useful, then I'll get permission to take it back again." End quotes. At the start of his study period, he is unwilling to keep pen and ink or a supply of writing paper in his cell, but went each day to his professor to obtain materials for his written exercises. This ended abruptly when Father Norbert told him to act like every other student and keep a sufficient supply in his cell. The deceptive simplicity of his resolutions concerning poverty conceals the sacrifice which they entailed. Though the words are few, they extended to every activity of his religious life and ensured that all was marked with the seal of holy poverty. In quotes, "My necessities must be poor, plain, and of little value, so that in my room, clothing, food, or anything else, the virtue of poverty may shine forth. To seek and to relish the worst things in the house, and to lack even what is necessary, not to give or receive anything without permission, nor to lend or borrow without similar permission, not to keep anything as my own, depriving myself of all that is not strictly necessary, such as books, furniture, etc., to take care that nothing goes to waste." End quotes. These were not empty promises, forgotten as soon as they were made. Methodically and perseveringly, Gabriel carried them out in daily practice until it had become second nature with him to seek the poorest and least wanted instead of the best and most acceptable. A glance at his books would betray the fact that elegant bindings had little appeal for him. Whenever possible, he picked for his use books that were well thumbed and in poor condition. The more disreputable they looked, the better he was pleased. In the weekly distribution of clean linen, towels, handkerchiefs, Gabriel sought at his share those that were patched, mended, or almost gone beyond repair. As one of his resolutions showed, Gabriel disliked any form of waste and went to extremes to economize. Small scraps of waste paper were kept for notes. Sometimes they were little bigger than a visiting card, but Gabriel treasured them for use. Spiritual notes, brief reminders, study notes were jotted down on the back of old letters. To save time and space, he devised a little secret code of his own, writing only the initial letter of each important word. When, as he often did, he composed a short prayer to the Madonna, to Saint Joseph, or to one of his patrons, he used this special shorthand, difficult to decipher even today. In this way, should one of his precious scraps of paper be lost, he kept his secret safe. Only to Father Norbert, recipient of his most cherished confidences, did he reveal his ingenious plan. In a monastery, many skills find unexpected scope. When Gabriel's habit needed repairs, he usually patched and mended it himself. From constant practice, he became very neat with a needle, but his pursuit of poverty went to such extremes that it earned him a reprimand. Gabriel made a hobby of collecting small snippets of thread, discarded his waste to use them for his mending. Father Norbert saw him doing this, and after a while very reasonably pointed out that he was losing far too much time threading and rethreading the needle after every few stitches. It would be more sensible, said the priest, to take sufficient thread to finish the job properly. Undoubtedly, Father Norbert was both edified and astonished at the lengths to which Gabriel was prepared to go, but he concealed his feelings. Indeed, not for the first time he teased Gabriel and poked fun at him before his companions to humble him. In quotes, "Oh, what a miser you are," he said. "It'll be the sad day when they make you a superior." End quotes. Chastity is often called the angelic virtue as a sign of its superlative excellence. Having taken a vow of chastity, Gabriel prayed long and fervently for grace to persevere the delicate bloom of holy purity. In quotes, "I find it impossible to express in words," wrote Father Norbert, "the love that Gabriel nourished for the angelic virtue, the jealousy with which he watched over it, and the care he took to avoid all that might in the least tarnish its luster." End quotes. In the novitiate, he had been taught the need for strict custody of the eyes. Gabriel took to heart the dry warning of Ecclesiastes, in quotes, "The eye is not filled with seeing, neither is the ear filled with hearing." If in the course of his walk he chanced to meet women or girls, he observed such custody of the eyes that he never even glanced in their direction. Yet he did so without making himself either noticeable or obtrusive. Usually he fingered the small crucifix on the end of his rosary beads, and then raised it in his hand as if to examine it more closely. In conforming to the rules of modesty, Gabriel showed a singular delicacy of conscience, which must not be taken for prudery. If anyone touched him lightly on the shoulder or even brushed against him accidentally, Gabriel instinctively drew back, and the expression of his face showed his reaction. He would never tuck up the sleeves of his habit, as was commonly done for heavy manual work. His very deportment was a lesson in modesty and had often a remarkable influence. Clerical students who came to make a retreat were greatly impressed when they saw Gabriel quietly going about his duties, looking to neither right nor left, quite unconscious of their scrutiny. Those who knew him best remarked that in everyday conversation, Gabriel disliked even an oblique or indirect reference to the opposite sex. This went so far that he would not use such common, harmless words as woman or girl. Instead, he preferred colorless or abstract words like a certain person, she or her. In this, he was certainly over-scrupulous, for he complained once to Father Norbert that some of his fellow students were at fault in the matter. Father Norbert very carefully pointed out that there was no defect at all in using such words, and that it was a more serious fault in himself to see evil where no evil existed. Perhaps it was on this occasion that he confided to a companion that God had allowed him to be humiliated to lessen his self-esteem. In quotes, "I was somewhat scandalized by a fault in one of my companions," he said, "and God allowed me to fall into exactly the same fault myself. It is good for me to be humbled." End quotes. In much the same way, any allusion, however slight or passing, to matters contrary to purity caused him mental anguish. In the study of the theology or church history, he lightly skipped over passages that dealt with such subjects. He was heard to say that he would never read the history of heresies by such an unimpeachable author as St. Alphonsus Liguori, because heresy was in general associated with the spirit of lust and impurity, often to a scandalous degree. Obedience undoubtedly holds the first place amongst the vows of religion. St. Teresa well terms it the road that leads most rapidly to the summit of perfection. St. Paul of the Cross calls it the foundation stone of all perfection. Gabriel's ready obedience was inspired by a spirit of lively faith, whether it was obedience to the rule which he had professed, to the imperious summons of the bell, or to the direction of a superior. In his brief resolution, he laid explicit stress on this point, which he regarded as of capital importance. In quotes, "Punctuality in obedience," leaving off reading what I have just begun to read, to receive the voice of the superior or the summons of the bell as the voice of God himself. Blind obedience without asking why or wherefore. Gabriel's extraordinary spirit of obedience was more remarkable because it was in direct opposition to his natural instincts. He was not one of those phlegmatic individuals who find in obedience a spur to action. His main difficulty was to restrain his exuberant temperament. As a boy, he had been impetuous and hot-tempered. As a young man, he was fond of having his own way and did not easily brook opposition to his wishes. From previous mistakes, he had become acutely aware of the danger of self-deception, and he no longer trusted his personal inclinations. In quotes, "God does not like self-will," he used to say. "If we had every possible good reason, every good intention, God is still not pleased if we do our own will." End quotes. With this deeper knowledge of his own complex character, Gabriel felt that it was vital for his every action to have the blessing of obedience. He became as docile and submissive as a child. No longer did he seem to have any choice or preference of his own. In all matters, great or small, he was content to do exactly as he was told. In quotes, "It was enough for me to tell him, 'Act in this way or in that,'" said Father Norbert. "I could be sure he would do just what he was told without any need for me to repeat my instructions or to insist on them." End quotes. In later years, Father Norbert sometimes explained to Gabriel the reasons for certain directions given him, but Gabriel never wanted to hear them. In quotes, "I don't need any reasons," he said, smiling to rob the words of any possibility of offense. "It's enough for me to know what I have to do. Obedience is enough for me." End quotes. Father Bernard Mary was another who noticed this development and commented, in quotes, "His submission and complete docility were amongst the most remarkable things observed in this youth." In Gabriel's case, this was especially noteworthy, since his most pronounced fault as a secular had been his ungovernable temper. No sooner had he joined the congregation than he reformed to such an extent that he no longer seemed to be his own master. The will of his superior, even if only intimated by a mere sign, was enough to make him do whatever was wanted. End quotes. By his first 3 vows, Gabriel had become a religious, but by his distinctive 4th vow, he became a passionist. The sign of the Passion, which he now carried proudly on his breast, was an ever-present reminder of his obligation. The words emblazoned on it, "The Passion of Jesus Christ," became his motto and his inspiration. As a student, his apostolic opportunities were very limited, but he could and did implant devotion to the Passion deeply in his own soul. The mention of the sufferings of Christ awakened an instant response from him. Often he spoke with such depth of feeling that his companions one by one fell silent, and with one accord turned to listen to him. All the love and all the compassion, all the gratitude of his sensitive heart was focused on the mystery of redemption. His fervor was the fruit of constant meditation on the Passion. He penetrated so deeply into the profound truths of Calvary that he was deeply moved in prayer. Try as he would, he could not quite conceal his feelings, betraying them in tears and audible ejaculations of love. At this point, the indefatigable Father Norbert sharply intervened, telling him that he was causing a disturbance, that he was a source of distraction to others who were also trying to pray. Gabriel bowed his head submissively and accepted the rebuke in silence. During those months of waiting at Moraval, Gabriel continued to reassure his father at frequent intervals about his health, for despite all that he had already said, Sancti Pacenti still had misgivings. He has here and there a few words of advice for his brothers, especially for Vincent, the youngest, in whose spiritual welfare he took a keen interest. Apparently, he had been reconciled to the fact that writing home was part of his normal duty, and no longer experienced the agonizing scruples that had troubled him during the early days in the monastery. 6 weeks after his profession, he wrote, in quotes, "Please forgive me, Father dear, if I say that your fear for my health lacks foundation, firstly because, since I came to this retreat, I feel better than I ever felt in my whole life. Secondly, because I remember writing before that if you didn't get a letter from me, then you'd know that I was all right. In that way, you'll have a good idea of how I'm getting along." End quotes. A month later, writing for Christmas, he continued in a similar strain, trying to reconcile his father to the fact that he was writing as often as possible. In quotes, "I am in the best of health, and there's nothing I need. We'll likely spend the whole winter here, as I told you in my last letter. One thing I must add to ease your mind, I write letters more often than anyone else, and to speak quite plainly, this is not our custom. So if you don't see my letters as often as you'd like to, please don't worry, because if anything special happens, I shan't fail to write." End quotes. The new year, 1858, brought changes in the home. Sancti Pacenti was busy making arrangements for his coming retirement from the active duty. He was now 69 years of age and not in the best of health. All his life had been spent as a hard-working official of the papal government, and he felt that he had earned the right to spend the evening of his days in peace and quietness. Gabriel was pleased to hear of his decision, and wrote in March to send his prayers and good wishes. In quotes, "I thank our Lord who has arranged for your retirement. The less troubles one has, the easier it is to attend to one's last end. After the brief labors of this short life, we may expect the all-powerful God to grant us lasting retirement and eternal peace. May Mary be our advocate and intercede to obtain this great grace for all of us. I shall fail to remember you and all our family, both living and dead, in my poor prayers." End quotes. At this period, Sancti Pacenti was very undecided about his future. Apparently, he had first entertained the idea of entering a monastery and dedicating the remainder of his life to God. Then he thought of leaving Spoleto and settling down in Rome, where a branch of the Pacenti family was already established. He asked what Gabriel thought of his plan. In the event he decided against any immediate change, and made up his mind to remain for the time being at Spoleto. Meanwhile, Gabriel wrote encouragingly and offered some prudent comment. In quotes, "You asked for my advice with regard to settling down in some city, but what can I say about it? I see nothing wrong with your proposal to settle in Rome, especially as my 3 brothers can all continue their work there under your supervision. But you ought to find out if the climate will suit you. In any case, during the summer, you can move to some nearby locality and thus avoid the excessive heat of Rome." End quotes. Presumably, as an indirect result of his father's decision to retire and set the family affairs in order, Gabriel found to his dismay they would have to attend a lawyer's office at Fermo to sign some legal documents regarding transfer of property. He made an effort to extricate himself, but without success. In quotes, "I'd be glad to know if this trip to Fermo is really necessary," he wrote rather pointedly, "or if the business can be settled in any other way. I'd much prefer that. However, if I have to go, Father Master will have no difficulty in going with me." End quotes. In April, then Gabriel set out for Fermo, accompanied not by Father Master, but by the ubiquitous Father Norbert. At the lawyer's office, he met his married sister Teresa, now a settled and self-possessed young matron of 28. By her own account, Teresa was at first surprised and then perhaps a little hurt by Gabriel's distant and frigid bearing. In quotes, "Although such a long time had elapsed since we had seen each other," she said, "he never said a word to me until his religious superior, who was with him, had given him leave to speak." Once the ice was broken, Gabriel thawed a little and asked her if she had any children. When Teresa almost tearfully answered that she had 2, Gabriel smiled and advised her to consecrate them to Mary by offering them at the Madonna's altar. At best, it was a brief and unsatisfactory conversation in the dusty surroundings of a legal office, with Gabriel out of his element and ill at ease, and Teresa not a little piqued to see him thus changed from the brother she had known so well. She noticed that he was paler and thinner than before. She sensed that he was withdrawn from the world, and in some way that passed her understanding, he was very close to God. Teresa was not the only one to be puzzled and surprised. When their business was concluded, Father Norbert briskly accompanied Gabriel to the Jesuit college. Several of the fathers who had known him at Spoleto were now teaching at Fermo. Amongst them was the rector, Father Rossi, who greeted them cordially and looked at Gabriel with speculative eyes. Was this young student, with shaven head and sandaled feet, really Francis Pacenti, one of their brightest pupils? As the Jesuit looked at the coarse black habit, he could not help recalling the brave display of style he had always associated with the young Pacenti. No, it was too much to believe. Externally, he might appear changed, but beneath it all, he must be still the bright youth they had all known so well. Father Rossi felt his doubts mounting. He drew Father Norbert aside out of earshot, and nodding towards Gabriel, asked abruptly in an undertone, in quotes, "How is that young man getting on?" "Very well indeed," replied Father Norbert shortly, a little nettled perhaps at the doubtful tone of the question. "Is that a fact?" persisted the rector. "Wasn't he inclined to be a bit flighty?" "The grace of his vocation has taken care of all that," said Father Norbert firmly. "He's an excellent young man. You couldn't ask for better. And if he continues the way he's going, as we've every reason to hope, he'll be a real saint." End quotes. Towards the end of his stay at Moravel, an incident occurred that had a lasting influence on Gabriel. Early in May, word came of the death of a student at Isola, Frater Peter of Mary. The unusual brief biography of the deceased was read in the refectory, and Gabriel quickly noted the coincidence of dates. Like himself, the dead student had received the habit on September 21st, and had been professed on September 22nd, exactly 4 years previously. Gabriel envied his quick transition to paradise. From his first days in religion, Gabriel had prayed to die young. He feared the danger of offending God or of growing tepid in the service of the Master. He even asked God that he might die of consumption, which Italians beautifully call the disease of the blessed, because it leaves the faculties intact to the end. When he first heard of this prayer, Father Norbert was both displeased and alarmed, but he could not in conscience forbid it, because he said it was a good prayer. But he made Gabriel add the proviso, if it be for the glory of God and his own spiritual advantage. After the death of Frater Peter, Gabriel's prayer grew more eager, more insistent than before. Was it then mere coincidence that Gabriel was to die within 4 years, to die of consumption, to die at Isola, where his body would rest in the same grave as that of the student whose speedy passage to heaven had moved him to wish for a like consumption?